that ere I spend it in
This was the late start, and I know that these things happen at events such as this. There's so many great, indeed, aspects of Irish heritage and culture being presented here at the Heritage Centre. It's a great tribute to the centre itself that they can take the opportunity to present all aspects, indeed, of Irish heritage and tradition. And yesterday I gave a talk on the importance of our patriotic tradition of Irish song and music. And as many of you know, my name is Derek Warfield. I performed and sung with the Wolfe Tones, found the band back in 1962. I've been singing on stage for 51 years, which is quite a long time. But it only seems like 51 weeks. And you know, I came to appreciate the value that music has had in Irish society down through the years. And I sought indeed to bring a value to the very simple message of song, poem and rhyme that was part of Irish tradition. You know, we have a very unique tradition in Ireland because of our history and our most recent history, of the colonial history of the last 700 years. We celebrate what in our society very differently than for the rest of Europe. In Europe, with the great palaces, they could celebrate their patriotic tradition in wonderful ceremonies. We could never do that in Ireland. And certainly in our recent history, we could never do that. So our monuments, if you like, to the events, issues, men, women that made indeed Irish identity important, our monuments are in our music. They're in our songs, they're in our ballads, and they were written in society all over Ireland, and indeed throughout the Irish diaspora across the world. And no matter where the Irish people travelled to, they brought their music with them. So whether it was here to America or in Australia, you'll find the input of Irish, indeed melody, poetry, literature is in every community. And in many ways, I suppose, it has enriched, indeed, the heritage and traditions of America. And I think most of you that have studied even a little of American heritage of music and song will know that Irish music had a profound effect on the earliest American music. So that's what I want to speak about today. And I must apologize, there's been a bit of a mix-up in terms of the presentation of different shows. So two of the lads that were supposed to play with me are also playing downstairs, and they're not magicians. They can't be in two places at one time. But I'm delighted to have my colleague and band member and fellow performer of the last 8 years, Damaris Woods, music teacher and banjo player extraordinary from County Meath in Ireland. I'd like to acknowledge her presence. Now, today I'm going to speak about the Irish in the colonial period. Now, if you were to take up any book of popular print about the American Revolution, you would find little reference to Irish involvement. And that's because the first histories of, indeed, the American Revolution were written by Anglo-Saxons. And they didn't acknowledge anybody else except their own creed. So it was indeed, if you want to look for African-American involvement or any native European involvement, you'll find a little of it, but you'll find very little from Ireland. But that indeed tended to that situation was heightened during the centenary of American independence and the Declaration in 1876. At the 100th anniversary of the American Revolution, many Irish people lived here in the States. And they were horrified to see that despite the input of Irish people, in every community in colonial America, there was nothing in popular print about Irish people. And there were several writers that tried to address this problem. But we have to remember the most important aspect of Irish people writing their history is that back in the 18th century and 19th century, Irish identity and the intellectual property of Irish people was not protected by the British government. So with the result that all the Irish heritage of music, poetry, song, dance, indeed, was considered by folks who set artistic standards in London as being worthless. The language, indeed, and the whole heritage of Irish people was considered, indeed, backward and was relegated to the margins, indeed, of artistic appreciation. So, when we go back to the 18th century, the period we're talking about, it was even worse than in the 1876. Because even today in Ireland, to find a definitive book on 90% of the population of Ireland in the 18th century, there's nothing. 90% of the population in the 18th century were Catholic. 10% were Protestant, and they controlled, indeed, the Parliament, the professions, and the rest of the people were relegated, indeed.
The penal laws still exist in the 1800s, in the 1770 something. When did we finish the penal laws? We couldn't have an education or a horse more than 5
Yes, the ladies just mentioned their fact. And I will answer questions afterwards. Let me deal with that question. The penal laws did exist in the 18th century, and right through the 18th century. They were on the statute books, but they were not enforced in any way. They were not enforced in the 18th century simply because the Parliament in Dublin couldn't enforce them. They didn't have the manpower. And there were some areas in Ireland, indeed, if they attempted to enforce them, there would have been a riot. So they didn't really enforce the penal laws in the 18th century, but they were always there on the books if they were ever needed. And if they were needed, and indeed, and if there was a war in Spain or France, and the English position of control in Ireland was under threat, they were dragged up straight away. And indeed, the native population of Ireland were put very quickly in their place. So, the period we're talking about in the 18th century, control of Ireland was paramount to the British government. And they had their men, the appoint all the bishops that sat in Armagh, the established church, the Episcopal church, they were generally all Englishmen, and they had indeed a great deal to say. The Parliament in Dublin operated indeed in a way that it ensured that it operated in the best interests of England, not of Ireland. And towards the middle of the 18th century, this began to change. And what happened was, the printed word was just like the internet today. Ideas then started to circulate in communities here in America and in Ireland, and many of the privileged aristocracy and ascendancy were looking for a better way forward. They wanted indeed to give a say to the folks in the rest of Ireland. And this was resisted by indeed those in power in London. It was also resisted indeed by many of the big landowners in Ireland. But by and large, the professional class of the Protestant ascendancy were now not seeking a British identity. They were looking inward to Ireland for an Irish identity. And this horrified London. The same thing was happening here in America, because indeed when King George, the first attempts in imposing the Stamp Act in the 1760s. Again, that was resisted by the colonists here in America. But the first to raise an objection here in America were the Irish. Irish voices were first to be heard because they knew what the consequences of those policies would be. Now, there was a huge clearance in Ireland of people from the estates to America in the 1720s and 30s. And most of these people were cleared off the estates in Antrim, in Monaghan, and most of the folks indeed were either Episcopal or indeed Presbyterian. And they were all shipped out to America by and large, and were very resentful of the fact many of them had come from Scotland and had been given land in the north of Ireland and then uprooted again out to America. And there was a great exodus of people during the 1740s, 50s and 60s and 70s to America from all ports in Ireland out to America. Now, there's very good details of the shipping records that were done by Michael J. O'Brien. He was a historian that for almost 75 years indeed wrote and researched on this topic. And he covered these ships that applied from Ireland and brought the immigrants to America, to mainly the ports of Savannah, Charleston, Philadelphia, Wilmington, Boston, and New York. And that's where the Irish largely emigrated to at that period. And there's one great difference between the immigrants of the 18th century and those of the 19th century, is that most of the people that came to America in the 1700s, 1740s, 50s, 60s, were of modest means. They didn't come destitute. They came for a better way of life. And they saw it indeed to have the security of being able to farm and indeed bring up their families in peace. And this country offered that. The immigrants, as you know, from in the 19th century, many, particularly from the Great Hunger on, came in desperation to this country to escape indeed a certain death that would befall them if they stayed in Ireland. So in the 1700s, the immigrants, indeed, many of them were skilled, many of them were educated, a minimum educated, many of them indeed settled in all of the eastern colonies from the Carolinas up to Vermont and Maine. And the records are there to show that. But they brought their music with them too. And of course, that music became very much part of the music of the colonial period. You know, my musicians are not here, but the first governor of Pennsylvania was a man called George Bryan. And George Bryan was born in Dublin. He's buried in Philadelphia. And the first history of any state in the Union was written by John Burke. And both of these men indeed came to America disillusioned with what was happening in Ireland. George Bryan was a great friend of George Lucas, who was a man that, you have to remember, we had a parliament in Dublin in the 70s, in the 70s and 100s. At that parliament, as I said, he was 100% Protestant. There wasn't represented or a democratic institution, but it did act in the interest of Ireland. The people that indeed went into that parliament had a vested interest in the country because they were big landowners, largely they were titled people. So in many respects, this parliament became more assertive of the rights of Ireland over the 18th century, and particularly when resistance came here in America. That gave Indeed, many of the Irish aristocracy, looking at people like John Adams, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and seeing that these people were also the educated ascendancy class, why can't we do the same in Ireland? And what you find, and particularly among the Parliament, when the Declaration of Independence was declared in 1776, you find the Parliament being more vocal and supportive about the American cause. The leader of the Parliament, Henry Wotton, is on record as having said that the American, indeed, Declaration was the only hope for mankind and the only saviour for Ireland. So, by and large, the aristocracy in Ireland were very supportive of the American cause for independence. And why was that? Well, Benjamin Franklin came to Ireland twice. In 1769, he came and he visited Dublin. He spent 6 weeks there, and he was entertained, I could only find on one occasion, by a man called Matthew Carey, or John Carey, Matthew Carey's father. And there was one trade that the Irish people could enter into in the 18th century. They could not be solicitors, they couldn't be barristers, they couldn't be surveyors, they were all closed to Catholics. But they could be, indeed, traders. They could be shipping agents, and that's where, or they could be importers, exporters, and that's where, indeed, the Irish excelled. And they could be suppliers of bakeries, and very shortly in the 1850s, or the 1750s, 60s, 70s, up until 1800, it was indeed the Catholic Irish that controlled the trade in and out of Ireland. And the Careys, like many Dublin merchants, had become modestly wealthy. So Benjamin Franklin would have been entertained by particularly the patriotic aristocracy, and he had a great sympathy with the Irish people. This is not commonly understood or known, that Franklin is on record as having said in Ireland, he said, is it any wonder that the people of Ireland, when they come to America, they are such great citizens? And he had witnessed the abject poverty of the ordinary people in the 18th century on his visits to Ireland. He had seen the destitution that was everywhere, and indeed the wealth, indeed, of the country that was in abundance. Ireland was a wealthy country. It was a populous country. There were 5 million people in Ireland in 1800. 5 million. There's only 6 million there today. It was half the population of the whole of Britain. There was 11 million people in Britain. 2 million of those were in Scotland, probably 1 million in Wales. So the population of England was only 8 million. There was 5 million in Ireland. Dublin had a population of 250,000, 250,000 people. There was only one city in the British Empire bigger than Dublin, and that was London. There was only 100,000 people in Birmingham, something similar in Manchester. Liverpool had 70 or 80,000. Glasgow had the same, but Dublin had 250,000. And there was only one city that was vying for its importance as the second city of the empire, and that was Philadelphia. So Dublin and Ireland in the 18th century became known as Georgian Ireland. And if you go to Dublin today, you'll see these beautiful houses that were built during that period when the aristocracy all lived in Dublin. The Parliament was in Dublin, the Custom House was built, the City Hall was built, the quays were built. Any building of importance that's in Dublin today was built in that period. And that's because, indeed, the Parliament sat there. So, when the war broke out in America, there was cheering in Dublin. The ordinary people went to the Phoenix Park and they demonstrated again in the outside the Viceregal Lodge in support of the American Revolution. Now, some of you might ask, why do we not know about this history? Well, there's a very simple reason. The British government never wanted you to know. They spent millions to keep it out of the textbooks and popular print over the last 200 years. Any other problem would have been addressed, but the impact of the American Revolution on Ireland was huge. We lost our parliament because of it. Indeed, the Act of Union was put into place. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, Irish politicians like Henry Grattan believed the British, who had promised them during the war that the rights and liberties that had been won by Americans by force of arms here would be peacefully granted to the Irish. But of course that didn't happen. They rolled back. They didn't want trouble in Ireland while the war was on here in America. So as soon as the Treaty of Paris was signed, out went the rights and liberties for Irish people. It was rolled back year after year after year, 1785, 86, 87, and despite the pleas, indeed, of rational politicians like Henry Grattan to have indeed the Parliament maintained and given more power to act in the interest of Ireland, indeed, his pleas fell on deaf ears. And when the Act of Union was imposed on Ireland, Henry Grattan was quoted as saying, "I sat by his cradle and followed its hairs." In other words, he had sat by the cradle of what could have been a great parliament, and he followed the hearse, indeed, into the Act of Union. Now, Henry Grattan knew that the Act of Union was disaster for the Irish people. It took away the power from Dublin, it took away the power of those who supported the music, the culture, the heritage. Now, and I'm going to deal with that now. The culture and heritage was supported by the aristocracy. Indeed, Ireland in the 18th century was a city of music. Dublin, indeed, was probably the most sought-after city for music in the whole of Europe. Musicians of note came, indeed. There were 16 instrument makers in the city of Dublin, all making, and indeed a living out of making musical instruments, from violins, violas, harpsichords, pianos, indeed every conceivable aspect of our music indeed was made in Dublin. It boasted 2 cathedrals with big choirs, and music was a very big part of Dublin. I'm sure many of you know that Frederick Handel came. The Messiah was first formed in Dublin in 1756, I'm not sure of the year, but it was first performed indeed in the Shamblesea Theatre. So Dublin indeed was a city that musically indeed was to the forefront of musical innovation in Europe. And there was a little bit of envy and jealousy in London at this. Because here were the people that were supposed to lead the way and be British subjects in Ireland, and the policies of the English government is always to make good English people out of Irish people. Why can't they be English? And here are the aristocracy and indeed the professional class not looking for a British identity, but looking for an Irish identity. There was consternation in London at this, because cultural control is central indeed to the way England have controlled their colonies and particularly controlled Ireland. And they've been in the business since Queen Elizabeth I. She was the one that started it. And she was a smart lady. She knew that she couldn't politically control Ireland if she didn't have cultural control. So she had to first of all destroy the universities. And the universities, the first one that the object of destruction was Clonfert in Galway, and that was destroyed in 1588. And there were 4,000 pupils at that university. 4,000 pupils in the 1580s, and it was closed down. Now, many of the learned professors and academics at that time pleaded with the authorities in England to grant it status as a university, but they didn't do that. because the teachers, the academics, the scholars that were there were all indeed all Irish. So they decided to set up their own University of Trinity College in Dublin, and that was set up around the same time, and Clonfert was closed. Now Clonfert and Clonmacnias at that time were two big of these. They were situated in the centre of Ireland, and both of those universities had a huge catchment area, and you can imagine the trade and the employment that they gave in those days. So for the point of view of the social life of the people who lived in the environment, it was disaster. For the school teachers, indeed many of them found themselves out of a job. And the closing of the universities in Ireland continued through the penal laws, but it had one unintended result. And the unintended result was that many of the teachers, many of the scholars, they didn't go to France, they came to America. And they came here, and you look at the 17th century here, and in the school classrooms of the colonial America, you'll find Irish teachers. And they were not preaching the goodness of King George. They were preaching, indeed, they were preaching revolution. And I have studied the lives of many of the folks, indeed, that signed the Declaration of Independence, and nearly all of them had, indeed, Irish schoolmasters. And it's extraordinary. No, you don't need, this is on record for many of them. You know, they went to a small schoolhouse in Pennsylvania or in New Hampshire, and the Irish schoolmaster gave instruction. So it was, to me, it's a big factor in the common cause that Irish people had, because they seen resistance to the Stamp Act as their fight too. They had seen what had happened in Ireland. They had seen the destitution of the country, when all the laws that were imposed on Irish trade, the restrictions on Irish import and export, were done for the benefit of England. And the Irish economy was almost strangled by the fact of these laws. And they knew that the same would happen here in America. So they were the first, they were possibly the only people here in colonial America that knew exactly what would happen. So when the war did break out, indeed, it was Irish men, indeed, that first volunteered their services. And the first ballad that I could find about the war was a song that was written in Philadelphia in 1776. And the British propaganda had said that the colonists would be defeated within a couple of weeks. They didn't know how to fire their guns right. They were all stupid. They were all, they wouldn't stand up. As soon as the redcoats came up, they'd all run and scatter. So the British defeat at Concord and Lexington was a huge shock to the people here in the colonies. And you have to remember that it was very evenly divided. 30% of the people were for the revolution and supported George Washington, 30% were against it, and 30% were neutral. It was seesaw. A lot of the people here in the colonies said, no, well, we don't really, you know, we like our attachment to England and their culture and identity. So when they were defeated in Concord, propaganda put out amongst the communities through newspapers and through talk and hearsay was that all of these people won't fight together. I can't see Calvinists and the Baptists and Presbyterians fighting alongside Papists. That won't happen. But it did happen. And they fought and died together. But the unity was inspired by Irish people, because they knew that if they didn't stay together, indeed the same thing was what happened in Ireland. So you find George Ryan, the man I mentioned, first governor of Philadelphia, inspirational in his words to keep that unity of purpose. And his gravestone, he's buried in Philadelphia. Here lies George Bryan, a man who fought against the misery and persecution of the English in colonial America. Very strong words on his tombstone in Philadelphia. I can't exactly memorize them. So, when the English were defeated at Concord, this man wrote this song, The Irishman's Epistle. I'm going to sing it to you now. And I only have my line up there. So, just get my glasses and I'll make sure I have it. You have to remember that satire is the one big thing in Irish songs that gets our message across very simply. And this is satirical. You can't imagine the consternation amongst the loyalists here in America when the British Army were defeated. I mean, they weren't expected to be defeated, and of course the jumping for joy of the Irish that they made the victory at Concord. So this is the song. Think I am makers of bulls, with your brains in your bridges and ass in your skulls. Get home with your muskets and put up your swords, and look in your books for the meaning of words. So you see now, me honeys, how much you're mistaken, for concord by discord can never be taken. You see how, me honeys, how wrong you can be. Such a medley of people could never agree. Muskets all bright, and sought to be frightening the folks at the side. And when you got there, how they powdered your pums, and all the way home, how they peppered your bums. Oh, it is not me, honeys, a comical crack, to be proud in the face and be shot in the back. Oh, you see now, me honeys, 'tis nothing at all, for you pull up the trigger and pop goes the ball. That we did not know how to be shooting our furlocks as smartly as you. And what have you got now? Where all you're designing, but a town without victuals for to sit and to dine in, and to look on the ground like a parcel of noodles to see how the Yankees have beaten the Doodles. I'm sure you'll have to wise, you'll make peace for your dinner, for fighting and faster will soon make you tenor. And we all stood our ground. No troopers of courage were there to be found. And they scattered and ran while our muskets refilled, and they never stopped running till they reached Bunker Hill. We besieged them and teased them with fifers and drummers. Our militias declared they were very good runners. To the sound of retreat, all our riflemen cheered, and the whole of New Hampshire it laughed and it jeered. When the exiles of Europe first came to these shores, they were met with the Calvinists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Protestants, Papists and Huguenots. Such a medley of people could never agree. What good sense had prevailed, and we lived peacefully. But the stamp-backed and redcoats disturbed our tranquility, and we fought a great fight to the best of ability. Lexington and Concord is where first we drew blood, and where liberty's banner unveiled first stood. So you see, tongue-in-cheek, the poets down in Philadelphia must have had some laugh. And of course, it was a great military show. You can't imagine, and the joy that was felt in Irish hearts at that defeat. John Barry, probably one man of Ireland that you probably know of his association with the American Revolution. During the war, he had so many British ships that he was offered by the British government a position in the Royal Navy. They said, John, would you come over and work for us, you know? And of course, it was sent in very nice language, and lovely letters and all this, and that all his past deeds were forgiven. But they forget about all the ships that he sunk, and he'd be given the command of the whole fleet. And he told him, he says, not if you offer to leave the command of the whole British Navy would I leave my country or my adopted country. And that was the attitude of all of the Irish. There was a very famous judge in Pennsylvania at the time, Judge Joe Black. And Judge Joe Black said, I have seen a white crow, I have seen a black swan, but an Irish opponent of American liberty I have never seen or heard. And that's the way it was. Irish people, George Washington was probably the one man that epitomized his trust in the Irish people, in as much that all his secretaries were Irish. They were the only ones he could trust. The only people that he could trust to write his letters were Irish. James McHenry, indeed John Fitzgerald. And John Fitzgerald met George Washington in 1866 and knew the Washington family before the war, lived in Alexandria. And he's a good example of, here's a man that served with Washington for 7 years, wrote his letters, protected his name, and he warned them of certain bodies who were trying to indeed undermine his leadership. And there's no biography of him. I can't believe there's no biography. He was a cousin of Lord Edward Fitzgerald, the great 1798 hero, who also fought in the American War, but on the British side, because he was a big landowner right where I live today in Kildare. His house is down the road from me.
Where?
And the extraordinary thing of when I was researching this CD, I said, I wonder what sort of music that George Washington liked. So I went into music stores and I came across this book called The Music That George Washington Knew. And it was written by a man called Amos Fisher. Very, very good book. Great music, and the man has transposed a lot of the music for me. She's such a musical scholar. And it's, I looked at the first song and his favourite song was, George Washington's favourite song was Patrick the Poor Soldier. I said, Jesus, that's very strange. And I looked at the words of it, and the opening line was, though Leixlip is proud of its cold shady bowers, its great falling waters and murmuring cascades. Now Leixlip is 2 or 3 miles from where I live. So I said, why is George Washington interested in Leixlip? What's the association? And of course I did a history and search, and I found that Patrick the Poor Soldier was an opera that was compiled and written in Dublin by a man called Owenson, who was indeed the son of Lady Morgan, who was the patriotic aristocracy. She believed indeed in the value of Irish tradition, heritage and music, and Owenson collected the music of O'Carolan and made an opera out of it in 1783. And this opera was called Patrick the Poor Soldier. And it was about the returning soldiers from in the English army coming back to Ireland, and the trauma that it meant for them having been in America, coming back indeed. And of course it was giving them value. So those who set the cultural standards in Ireland, seeing all this talk about American Revolution on the stage in Ireland, oh, they didn't like it. The show was taken off the stage. The theatre was closed down. But it didn't stop the show from coming out to America. It was performed in America 9 months later, and George Washington was the first to go to see it. And he would get it performed in New York and performed in Philadelphia to get up the noses of the British government. And that's, I mean, the music of that song is credited today with a man called John Shield, who presented it in London. Now, he didn't write the music. And that very often happened in those days. The man that was responsible for writing the music was Torlock O'Carolan, and most of the tunes on are Irish tunes. But again, because we had nobody to protect our intellectual property, our musical property, the music was claimed by everybody. So we get no credit. Poor Torlock O'Carolan gets no credit. As I said yesterday, I always believed that he wrote the music for the national anthem here, the Star-Spangled Banner. Because it's said by some musicologists that he probably did. We can't prove it, we've no recordings. But the music that was played on the harp back in the 1850s and 60s is very similar to the music. And when you read the history of the Star-Spangled Banner, you'll see they'll say it was a tune called the Anacron in Heaven. And that indeed was a society that existed in London that wrote a song about this Anacron in Heaven, but they didn't write the music. The music had come from Ireland. They didn't write the music, they wrote the words. So John Shield is credited with this Patrick, poor soldier, but of course he didn't write the music. The music was written by Torlock O'Carolan. I want to ask the Marcus maybe to play a tune. You're all familiar with the work of Torlock O'Carolan, are you? Yes, and his music. Well, you have to remember that in the 18th century, O'Carolan's music imposed himself on two generations. He was loved, indeed, by the Irish people, and the aristocracy completely had embraced the music of O'Carolan. And O'Carolan wanted to incorporate the new ideas of music that were all over Europe. And of course, this gave great power, indeed, to the traditions and musical heritage of Ireland. But again, those who set cultural standards in London didn't like this. They didn't like that power that was coming from the bottom up in Ireland. They wanted to impose their cultural standards, indeed, on Irish music in Ireland. So the man who collected O'Carolan's music, Edward Bunting. Edward Bunting was an Englishman, first man, printed press, 18th century, first time they were able to write down music and mass produce it and give it to everyone to play. Edward Bunting. Edward Bunting entertained Wolfe Tones in 1795 on his last night as a free man in Ireland with his family before he came to Philadelphia, indeed to get French aid and to see how Americans had defeated the English in the war. That's why he came to Philadelphia. He came to Philadelphia indeed to seek French aid. It was James Monroe that made that possible. James Monroe was American representative in Paris when Wolfe Tones went there. So Edward Bunting, when he sat indeed and collected the music of O'Carolan, those who set artistic standards in London didn't like that. And when Edward Bunting died, he died in 1836. He died, and the great collector of Irish music, George Petrie, observed when he died. The great musicologist, musician, and collector died today in 1836. And there was not a word, sentence, written or uttered by any person, pen, or publication about his life and death. He died totally ignored by those indeed who control culturally the music and artistic appreciation in Ireland. Bunting indeed was so marginalised in Irish society that he died as a pauper. Nobody wanted to know about it. Because indeed those who set the standards in London had relegated his work to the margins indeed of artistic merit. George Petrie is one shining example of devotion to to Irish music, architecture, and indeed heritage. A wonderful man. And he was horrified to know that such a man could pass away without any, indeed, tribute being paid to him. So, I'm joined by my friends, and this is Gary and Larry. Give them a big round of applause. And I might ask them to play just a little piece of a carol for you, called "O Carol as a Seed." And incidentally, I had a great privilege of performing in Francis Tavern in New York about 3 weeks ago. Now, Francis Tavern is a tavern that's still in the same position and the same building when the British left New York in 1783. It was Washington came into the city with his army, and the British left, and they had a dinner in Francis Tavern, and it said that it was a joyous occasion. Well, we played there, and it was a wonderful experience to be able to go into a building that had been used as a means of celebration back in, I think it was November the 24th, 1783. And we played there. And I was reading in the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick. It's the oldest fraternal Irish organisation, and it was in existence at that time. And very, very fortunately, they published the menu of what they ate. But they also published the music that they played. And one of the pieces of music that they played was this piece of music, Carol as a Seed. So enjoy it, it's a beautiful piece. So Carolyn's music imposed itself not just on Georgian Island, but indeed here in America. And as many of you know, Virginia was probably the place where I always find I play a lot in Virginia, I play a lot all over America, but I always find it's the part of Ireland, the part of America that most closely resembles indeed the celebration of traditions that we have in similar. Dance was always very popular in Virginia, and indeed looking at the life of George Washington and his association with the Irish, I found that many of the music teacher that taught his daughter and his adopted son was an Irishman that lived in Alexandria. And he, as many of you know, had a wonderful admiration for the Irish. And this is not there's a wonderful book written by Michael Gaughan, and he wrote, indeed, in glowing terms about George Washington's appreciation of the commitment that the Irish people had to the revolution. And what I'd like to see today, and I was speaking, indeed, to a gentleman earlier, is that I would like, this is a modest, indeed, recognition of that involvement. It took me 7-8 years to do it, to collect the music and collect the literature and to put it all in place. But I hope it will inspire other people to do greater, and I have greater facilities at their disposal. I had to do this while trying to make a living and try to travel and try to perform, and it's not easy. So if it took me 7 or 8 years to do that, God only knows, you know, there are some PhD students out there that will be able to address many of the aspects that I could only touch on. It's very modest in its, but I try to mention as many books that I came across in my research. And as most of you know, the Pennsylvania line that fought in every battle during the war was largely Irish. It was probably 75–80% Irish. And I always like to remind the people of the importance of they fought everywhere and surrendered nowhere. And that's what it's said about. And the paymaster of the Pennsylvania line was a fiddle player. So I wonder why he got that gig. And this fiddle player used to, his name, wait for this, was George Bush. So George Bush, you know, and I've seen this first, actually George was in the White House, and I said to myself, God, this is very, I wonder with any relation. So I said, I'll have to do research and see where he came from. Now I wasn't expecting that his father was born in Dublin, but that's what happened. And George Bush, this fiddle player, he went along the line giving the soldiers their money, and of course he heard lots of music, and he wrote it down, and he kept a volume of papers that lay in an attic in Delaware until 1919, and his great-great-granddaughter got this music and she published it. Her name is Kate Van Winkler. And Kate, God love her, she didn't do much research into his background, but I found he was from Dublin, and of course I found also he was no relation to the George Bush. I was very disappointed with that because I was hoping to send him a CD. And but George Bush indeed collected wonderful tunes. And I brought this book to Damaris, and I said, Damaris is very quick at reading the music. And I said, do you recognise any of those tunes in that book? Well, she says, they're all Irish. And of course they were all Irish. Because the Pennsylvania line was all Irish. So the songs that he sung and the music that he played was all Irish. And I included some of his music on the CD. One or two of his tracks. I think Miss Moore's Rant and Kitty Will You Marry Me. And he wasn't the only musicologist I discovered. I went to Virginia, the University of Virginia, and I was reading the life of John Burke, the man who wrote the history of Virginia. Now John Burke, every state in the Union has a history today, but the first history was written by the Irishman, John Burke. And John Burke wrote the most popular play in America during the colonial period. A play he wrote on his way to America called Bunker Hill. It was performed for 60 years. And Burke was passionate about the libertarian right of the press to be free speech. You owe him a great deal. He founded 4 papers, John Burke. But he wrote the first history of any state, the history of Virginia. And I was reading about this, a little essay that was done by a man called Alcott down in Virginia. And I see him that he was working before he died with a man called John McCreary, a musician, on the music of Ireland. So I said, I wonder where that went to. So I went to the University of Virginia and found one of the 2 copies of the collection that's available today. And it's a mine of information musically of what was available. John McCreary must have been a tremendous musician, and his literature is even more important, because what he wrote about the weakened state of Irish history, the weakened state of Irish music, and the appreciation and value that was being presented in Europe. It was being appropriated by everybody. Indeed, it was being taken and called Scottish tunes, German tunes. The music, indeed, was like ransacked, because there was nobody to protect, indeed, the value of the authorship of the music. And John McCreary wrote this in his text back in 1806. Now, I included some of his tunes, indeed, on this as well, and some of his music. And with work, they sought to raise the value, indeed, of Irish literature, and to bring, indeed, their experience into American heritage. Sadly, Burke died before. If you come across the history of Virginia, it's a 4-volume set today, very expensive to buy. But 3 of those volumes were written by John Burke. The 4th volume was finished by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson obviously seen the value in it, and he finished after the book, and he died in a duel. And Jefferson, who had also, you know, had a great sympathy with Ireland and the cause of our country. And there's one last man I want to mention. I meant to give him more time. Was Matthew Carey, and I said to you at the very start that when Benjamin Franklin went to Ireland, he met the Carey family. And Carey's father, I mean, I wasn't there. I have to deduce this from the associations that I read about Carey's life, and indeed the things I read in Dublin, asked him to take Matthew to Paris with him and to show him how to use the printing press. And Benjamin Franklin took Carey to Paris and taught him the rudiments of printing. And you're all beneficiaries of Carey today, because Carey was the first man in America to publish, indeed, a critical analysis of how the American Republic would evolve. He wrote a book called The Olive Branch back in the late 18th century, around 1895, 96. The first edition was put out. It went into 10 or 12 editions. It was the most popular book in America. It was called The Olive Branch. Matthew Carey published the first Catholic Bible in America. He published the first maps, and years ago you'd be able to buy those maps, indeed, in antique stores, but you couldn't buy them today because they're astronomical prices. All of Matthew Carey's stuff now is priceless. But the man was a great loss to Ireland. He was run out of Ireland because Carey, when he went to and was taught the printing by Benjamin Franklin in France, he came back to Ireland during the war, around 1778. And he set up a paper in Dublin called the Irish Volunteer. It didn't last too long because, you know, the colonial government didn't like any criticism. And Carey's paper became immediately the best-selling newspaper in Ireland. And he had articles in it about the waste of dueling. He was totally against the dueling that was everywhere at that time. He had articles in about different aspects of social life in Ireland. And it was, I suppose, revolutionary in the way that it was circulated, because in Dublin, as I said, you had a big population, maybe at that time around 200,000, and the paper became hugely popular. So Carey was arrested, and he left Dublin in disguise as a woman on a ship. And at that time there was a regular shipping service between Dublin and Wilmington. The boat boats used to go to Wilmington from Dublin. And Kerry came to this country, and when he came here, his reputation had preceded him, and he was given every help to go back. He was the first man to publish Edgar Allan Poe. He was the first man to publish the maps of America, and his son, Henry, was one of the founding members of the Republican Party and worked for President Lincoln during the war. So the whole family, indeed, spent 100 years of devotion to this country, the Careys. They never sought political office. And Matthew Carey he didn't want, indeed, recognition or credit for the things. He just wanted to see the experiment of America successful. And he wrote some very profound books about Ireland. He wrote a great book called Ireland Vindicated, which is about the 17th century Ireland, and indeed the plantations, and refuting indeed the historians' accounts of the massacres that occurred in the 17th century of Protestants in Ireland. Carey wrote that in Philadelphia, and it's called Ireland Vindicated. So that's about as much as I can tell you in my time given to me. And I want to thank each and every one of you for coming along. I hope I've enlightened you a little bit. And if you want to take the names of any of these people down afterwards and look for the literature, I'll answer questions now. If you have any questions, yes?
Yes, did Carolyn's music include?
Lass, it was to none but me, and all I've done